Hi, I'm Jackie and thanks so much for visiting my channel. So this video series is all about how to navigate and crush your college interview. And it'll be everything from what to expect, how to prepare, how you're scored, and also some tips and most common interview questions and answers that I've experienced in the 1 year where I was an alumni interviewer for Stanford. Now, a bit of background on me and my qualifications to be helpful. The first is that I am a Stanford grad myself. I did my undergrad and master's at Stanford. And while at Stanford, actually was running a college consulting business with two friends of mine. It's my first year out of graduating. I was actually an alumni interviewer out in New York. The third thing is that I've navigated this interview process myself. I know exactly how stressful it can be. I interviewed and applied successfully to schools like Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, Georgetown, USC, UC Berkeley, and actually got full scholarships to both USC and Berkeley, which require an extra step in the interview process. I want to start with 5 things that you should know just about how the interview process works. So first and foremost, people always ask, how does the interview impact my application? And if it's optional, should I opt in? My honest answer to this is yes, you should always take the opportunity to interview if it is your top choice school. And the reason I say this is because as an interviewer myself, I feel like I've never given a very, very negative review on a student. In fact, you're coached to really start in the middle and give the student a neutral review. And it's actually really rare to use a 1 on your scale, which means they're terrible, or also a 5 on your scale, which means they're just out of this world amazing. So I'm saying this because it essentially means that your interview, for the most part, from what I've seen, will not hurt you, but it can help you. In terms of how it actually impacts your application, if you flunked out of high school and had terrible essays and didn't put effort in, obviously this doesn't save a sinking ship. But I would say that what the interview does is it adds life to your application. It helps your admissions committee understand what things are actually important to you and who you are as a person. It's another layer to add a voice to your application that otherwise obviously doesn't have much personality because it looks really similar to all the students who got perfect scores on their SATs and perfect GPAs. The second thing is people always want to know, what does my interviewer know about me going in? I will say for Stanford specifically, you really don't know anything. I got the name of my student and what high school they went to, and that was pretty much it. Now, other schools are different. I remember for Harvard, I had to fill out a questionnaire that was essentially highlighting the key things in my application. But for the most part, these interviews are focused on getting to know you as a person. Think of it as a really informal coffee chat with a friend who just also happens to be a Stanford alumnus. Third, how does the interview actually start out? And I think this is helpful to know so that you're not coming in as a deer in headlights and you know what to expect. When you sit down for your interview, typically I would introduce myself and say, hi, I'm Jackie. I studied public policy and management science and engineering at Stanford. Here are some extracurriculars I was involved in. And you're taught to try to make the interviewee feel really comfortable. So normally I would say something like, just so you know, I'll be taking notes during this interview. It'll last about an hour. I'm just writing so I remember all the good things to say in my report, but wanted to tell you so it doesn't throw you off. In terms of how this works, I'll start with a bit about me, and then I want to obviously know about you and what drives you and why you're excited about Stanford, and then I really want to leave time for questions at the end for you to ask. Fourth thing, location and dress code. Now this varies per school, but I would say that for Stanford specifically, they actually advise you to make sure to choose a location where your interviewee will not be uncomfortable. So this means not your office, not anywhere where you feel like you should be wearing a suit or business casual. I would say most common locations were coffee shops, Starbucks, and so forth. In terms of dress code, I would say smart casual. Always better to err on the side of more formal, but you don't need to be wearing a tux or a sheath dress. Just make sure it's appropriate and make sure it's something that you feel good in. When you feel pretty, when you feel handsome, you just perform better and you're more charismatic, and that's something that will win you extra brownie points in your interview. And the last thing to remember is that your interviewer is nervous too. When I first started interviewing, I felt like it was a huge responsibility. I was meeting with great students and I wanted them to do well in the process. I wanted to make sure that I didn't make mistakes and make a bad call and miss a really good student. I was just as nervous as my interviewee, and I got excited when I felt like they enjoyed speaking to me and that they gave me positive energy. So just remember that and help that frame how you think about preparing for these. Tip number 1 is to be on time. If it's in person, get there 20 to 30 minutes early and just sit and listen to music, relax. If it's a video interview, which will likely be happening given the state of the world today, make sure that you check that your connection works, that you have a quiet space, that your resolution is clear, test run it with your mom or dad or friend. There's a lot of things in an interview that you can't control, but this is something you can absolutely control, and it also happens to be your first impression. Interviewers are probably not supposed to dock you for being late, but interviewers are human too. If I got to a coffee shop and the applicant is 30 minutes late, then I can't help but wonder, do they actually want to go to Stanford? Do they actually want to go to my university? The second is, to the extent that you can, treat it like a coffee with someone you want to be friends with. When I was interviewing, the one thing I was trying to figure out in my head wasn't anything about the students' GPA or how smart they were. It was really, could I see them biking along campus at Stanford among my peers that I became friends with at Stanford? Could I see them succeeding, being happy in, thriving in that culture? So really treat it like a casual conversation versus just a one-sided interview where you're being evaluated. It'll help you relax, it'll help you be more confident, and ultimately perform better. The third thing, be yourself and be human. So many students have a picture in their head of how they need to come off. They need to come off super smart, they need to talk about their GPA, their SAT scores, all those things. I'm here to tell you that stats are honestly boring and they're not memorable. If you think about all the students that will have the initiative to be applying to a place like Stanford, they all have amazing grades, they all have amazing SAT scores, and the way you stand out, and frankly, the interviewees that I remember the most were ones that were human and were just themselves, and they had a strong sense of self, and they told me stories. Stories about their life are memorable. Stories about what drives them and what makes them passionate about things, that's so much more memorable than a perfect score in SAT and being valedictorian of your class, which, by the way, when you're applying to Stanford, those students are a dime a dozen. Fourth thing, do your research on each school that you apply to. I like to think of it as every school has a different personality. For example, Stanford, people bike on campus all the time. When you come into Stanford, there's this line of palm trees. The Stanford band has gotten, no pun intended, banned from multiple places for being too wacky. It's a really quirky place. They love people who are creative, really intellectually curious. And yes, everyone is smart and intellectually rigorous, but I would say that most students at Stanford do not prioritize their grades. Meanwhile, a place like MIT is known for being more academically rigid. Yale is known for being more artsy. Each school has a different personality, and to the extent that you can, before going into your interview, if you can kind of picture what your person will be like and the environment that they were in for 4 years or so, it'll help you be more prepared for what you'll expect across the table from you. Tip number 5. Make a list of 3 things that you absolutely cannot leave your interview without sharing. And this is where I think you really stand out. When an admissions committee is going through so many applications and there's a laundry list of activities, sometimes they miss what's most important to you. And the way you combat that is through interviews and your essays by highlighting what actually out of those activities really matter to you. My 3 things were pretty simple. The first was that I was editor-in-chief of my high school yearbook and I really fell in love with storytelling. The second is that I competed in pageants and learned about what feminism meant to me and built confidence through that experience, something that was super unexpected. And the last thing was that I worked at an ice cream shop at Baskin-Robbins and learned about the value of hard work and manual labor jobs and how hard the real life world is and how tough entering the workforce is, even with such a seemingly trivial job. These were my 3 things. My application maybe had 10 to 20 activities, But in terms of the ones I wanted the interviewer to remember when they were writing out my report, I wrote those 3 things because I thought they made me most likable, I thought they made me most human, and I thought they showed a little bit about my creativity and what drives me. 6, on this note, when you're storytelling, use structure. Structure matters because it helps your interviewer remember things. You don't know if your interviewer is going to be tired or coming from work when you meet them, and structure helps them paint a clearer picture of what you're trying to say. I like to use the STAR framework. This is, first, what was the situation that you were in? Example, I joined a yearbook staff at my high school when it was super new and just in its 2nd year of operation. Task, what was your task? I rose up to editor-in-chief my sophomore year, which was the youngest person ever to really assume that role. That was a task. What was my action in that role? In my time as editor-in-chief, I encouraged my staff to really focus on quality of photos and to hunt for stories that were unconventional rather than just the textbook stories that you're used to seeing in a yearbook. That was my action. And then last, what was the result? This should show the impact that you directly drove. My result. The book went on to win Best in Show, which was the best prize you could receive and highest honor for the San Diego County yearbooks. 7, provide context. What I mean by this is that sometimes I would see that students are really close to whatever activity they're talking about, and it makes sense because you've spent so much time in it, but then you wrongly assume that your interviewer has that context too. Now, obviously, there are things that are very common: Intel Science Fair finalist, Science Olympiad winner, student body president. All these things are common things, and most interviewers have a sense in their head of how to value these different extracurriculars. But if it's something that they don't have much context about, you need to call out why your role was significant. So in the case of yearbook, one thing that I could say is that I raised sales from X number to X number in the time that I was editor-in-chief. And this was significant because this had never been done before. But call out why your achievements are important and why they're significant to you. 8, be humble. And this probably goes without saying, but you'd be surprised how many students come in and they just come off as entitled, or they come off thinking that because they have the best grades or because they're valedictorian, they deserve a seat at the table at Stanford. And I would say, as an interviewer, nothing was more off-putting. You have to remember that your interviewers are also alumni. They got into the school that you're applying to, and they're probably very successful in their career now. Number 9, practice makes perfect. I've had so many students and friends come to me for not only college interviews but job interviews and just tell me, I'm just not a good interviewer. I get nervous, all these things. I don't think that's true for anyone. I think that practice really does make perfect. And in the case of your interview, you can practice with your parent, give them 10 mock questions, record yourself so you know exactly what the person across from you will be seeing. Practice in the mirror. You can get better, and the nice thing about college interviews is there's not that many questions actually that we can ask. Last thing is, write a good thank you note. Your interviewer is a volunteer. They're usually not getting paid, and they volunteer because they're excited to meet students like yourselves who could be a part of their alumni class eventually. Here's a quick template that I like. It's really, hey, ex-interviewer, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really enjoyed learning about X, and in this X box, you really should talk about something they shared about the school and make it as thoughtful as possible, and then just sign off. It's really, really simple, but it goes a long way. I hope you enjoyed this content, and if you have any ideas for what you'd like to see, please subscribe and comment below.